Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about Trump and how he continues to cause chaos in Canada. Will our relationship ever be the same? Our guest for the show is Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome, Ken. Thank you for being here.
Good to be with you. I hope Americans are aware that you've had some dramatic effects in Canada. We have sports teams that play games in Canada and the US, such as the National Hockey League. And so when hockey teams lately have shown up in Canada and they start to play the American anthem, the crowd boos very vociferously. When they play a basketball game in Toronto, the crowd, when they play the American anthem, boos. Trump is having a pretty dramatic effect on the psychology of what Canadians think of Americans. And I think that that's pretty tiny compared to what the rest of the world is thinking about America and Trump's actions. Because if he's going to pick on his two closest neighbors and supposedly his closest friend for centuries, the rest of the world really considers the United States is no longer reliable. Any contract they have with them is irrelevant. Trump has really established that Americans cannot be trusted. They're not worthy of diddly squat.
Yeah. Well, so the beat goes on since our last conversation. When we spoke last, Ken, you talked about the fact that in some provinces, there were people who actually supported Trump and wanted to see Canada become the 51st state. Is that changed?
No, that still exists. There are, let's say, Canada economically is about a little bit smaller than California economically. Geographically, it's actually larger than the United States, including Alaska. So that you've got very diverse population in Canada, very diverse economics, different thinking. However, nobody likes to have somebody, be a big bully, be ugly. Nice human qualities. Trump's treatment of Canada exhibits none of those. You cannot respect a neighbor. Even the people who think that Canada and the United States could be closer economically than they are, still don't like an awful lot of things about the U.S. Certainly, the attitude towards further integration goes downhill with Trump's attitude. That is, the Elon Musk and Trump behavior with regard to all of the U.S. government agencies, simply chop off foreign aid without any notice or empathy whatsoever. Really doesn't augur well for somebody saying, gee, how would you like to be partners with these ugly people?
Well, one of the big questions that the people I talk to are asking is why? Do people ask that question in Canada, and do they have an answer about why he's doing all of this? The 51st state, the insults, and the tariffs. Why?
We do not have any clever answers for that in Canada, other than he just really relishes being a bully. He relishes drowning everything else out of the news cycle.
I noticed today that two of your ministers had resigned. Can you talk about that? Why is that? Does that have anything to do with this crisis?
No, I think it really has to do with uh, the fact that the current Liberal government headed by Trudeau has prorogued our government and our parliament rather, and really they're not doing an awful lot that the country needs. Under the threats from Trump, we really are dealing with a limping government because our parliament isn't in session, uh, and that the provincial government governor, they're not governors, they're premiers of provinces. They're left holding the bag, trying to, coordinate things between themselves in the absence of a federal leader.
I wonder too that what Trump has done in his first term and now again in even greater intensity is he's divided people. And then everybody lives in their own bubble and they hate the other bubble and so forth. And it's not a happy time. It wasn't and it isn't. Do you see the same process happening in Canada where people are being divided, where institutions and organizations and officials are being divided the way it's happening in the US?
Yes, the tariffs give a good example of that. For example, the province of Alberta happens to have great wealth in terms of oil and gas, and they export oil and gas. So when, the premier of Ontario, where they export automobiles, like all of the auto production that's in Canada is virtually all of it's in southern Ontario, near Toronto and between Toronto and Detroit kind of thing. And that premier of Ontario would say, well, what we should do to, bring the U.S. into line if they're going to impose all these ugly tariffs, et cetera, we should have an export tariff on oil and gas, or we should just shut off the flow of oil and gas. They doesn't say that that the province of Quebec should shut off the transfer of electricity to New York City. Because they're too cozy with them in terms of the product. What those two provinces do vis-a-vis the U.S. compared to what the western part of Canada does. So you get a little bit of this, Trump's wish, as any bully would say, divide and conquer. If you can create division in Canada, he thinks that's a gain. Where overall his effect has been to improve the unity in Canada and to improve people who would otherwise be adversaries to actually be working together for common solutions. But with regard to this whole tariff thing, I think there's an interesting kind of way to look at it from a point of view of economics. My economic training teaches me to take a kind of a lesson to say, Trump wants to solve his deficit by having, the trade deficit by imposing tariffs. Well, that's like an alcoholic, somebody addicted to alcohol and booze, blaming Coors manufacturing company, or blaming the distiller. It has no connection whatsoever. And really, the whole idea that he takes a variety of actions supposedly to correct the U.S. deficit in its balance of trade. And really, most of the actions he's taking are just incorrect. Like, you have to go back and say, economically, why does the United States run a phenomenal trade deficit with the rest of the world? Well, take a little wee example would be, if Brazil and India are doing some international trade. Well, currently they do that in US dollars because it's US dollar is the reserve currency and the companies have that. So if they're going to increase the trade, they need a few extra US dollars. Well, if you increase the demand for US dollars, then the United States then, can increase its bad habits. That is, bad habits are where you don't need to save very much. Like the rate of savings in the United States is very, very low. The pressure on consumption is really, really high. That is, Americans consume more than they should, save less than they should, and then you combine that with all levels of U.S. government tend to run very, very large deficits. Well, I wonder, why everything doesn't work too well. If you're going to buy so much from foreigners, that you're going to have a deficit in the amount of trade. If you want more things from other people than is reasonable, you end up pushing the value of the U.S. dollar up and other currencies down. For example, picking on Canada in terms of trade, if you impose a bunch of tariffs on Canada, the first thing that happens is the Canadian dollar will go down in value. Well, it's already gone down in value, and that tends to offset the effect. If the Canadian dollar goes down in value, then really, the Canadian has to pay more to buy anything that would have come from the U.S. Well, they just won't do that. They'll pick it from somewhere else. And similarly, the American, his response is more the opposite, that if the US dollar goes up in value compared to other currencies, then it's cheaper for the American to buy a good from Bongo Bongo or Hong Kong or China or Canada or Mexico or anywhere else than it is to buy what yesterday was made in the US for a lower price. The whole idea of tariffs, in my mind, as in just thinking of it logically, why is Trump trying to impose tariffs? And my belief is the number one dominant reason is in order to finance the tax cuts for the very wealthy in the U.S. I mean, any economist that he has would tell him it's very stupid.
This takes me to a question that I wanted to ask you before, and that is Trump seems to be favoring cryptocurrency. Until last June, when he found that the crypto industry was making substantial political contributions to Republicans, he opposed cryptocurrency. But then he turned on a dime, literally, and began supporting it. And he's supporting it now. And one of his initiatives is to create a wealth fund with U.S. government money, taxpayer money, and have a reserve, a la Fort Knox, a reserve of cryptocurrency, thus raising the price, thus helping out any oligarch who is investing in cryptocurrency. So my question to you is, how does this work in the long term? Apparently, he plans to make a lot of money. Elon Musk plans to make a lot of money with cryptocurrency. How does this affect the value of the dollar?
I really don't know. Even though I have a lot of economic training, I really think that it won't change the status, certainly in the short run. I think that an awful lot of Trump's moves have to be thought in terms of what does it do in terms of filling his pocket? And what does it do to help his wealthy friends who in turn are looking primarily at filling their pocket? They're not looking at what's in the public's good, what's in the United States is good. It's just what's in it for them individually. Why, knock down all the regulations you can think of? Why try to skinny up the U.S. government? Anything that they can cut it. Well, the reason is if you have less government, then you have less need for tax, and therefore they will pay less tax. It's really almost like a one-for-one transactional matter. It's
Yeah.
insane in terms of the public good.
Yeah. What about the effect of cryptocurrency on the status of the American dollar as the reserve currency? There are those, for example, in BRICS that would like to change that. They would like to topple the American dollar as a reserve currency. Your thoughts about whether we're headed there?
I think we're going to inch that direction. I don't know when major countries will take the jump. There's one small country in Latin America that actually has accepted cryptocurrency as their standard. So that the cryptocurrencies every day they're more accepted than they were yesterday. Now, accepted for what? And of course, if you're going to have as a reserve currency, you got to have one particular cryptocurrency to dominate. And how is that controlled and where? And so far, I don't think that the public has much trust in the basis for cryptocurrencies, that they are really as safe as some people may say they are.
Well, it's vaporware, isn't it? There's no support for it at all. There's no value, there's no precious metal, there's no nothing. So that at the end of the day, if there's a run on it, it disappears like vapor, right?
Okay, but when Nixon removed the gold as backing for the U.S. dollar, what replaced it?
The full faith and credit of the United States, and it's been going on that ever since.
What good is that with Trump?
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah. So the other thing I've read about is that there are countries in Europe, groups of countries in Europe within the EU that are taking countermeasures collectively. In other words, they collaborate to find countermeasures, and they are organizing trade with other countries other than the U.S. And I wonder, what Justin Trudeau is doing about countermeasures, whether they are in place, whether they are effective, whether they are following the same pattern or a different pattern, and what other countries is Canada thinking of trading with?
Right now, Canadian federal government's in flux. That is, the Liberal government, which was Trudeau's party, Trudeau's government, was a coalition with another party. The coalition partner has said they'd had enough and they weren't going to support Trudeau anymore. So Canada will have an election in 2 or 3 months, and then we'll settle down to some new government and can do something specifically. But really, Canada, much like the United States, is the government doesn't determine most things. Most things are decided by the corporations that deal in particular transactions. That is, automobile companies kind of decide what the world automobile business is going to be. Governments react to what they're doing. If China's going to subsidize the electric vehicles in other countries, some countries will say, oh, goody, goody, we get to get electric vehicles at a discount. And so we will therefore help China out with their subsidy and with their intent to get volume up to where they dominate the industry and can have some economies of scale. The next country, reacts differently. Uh, so it's pretty well along those lines.
You think it's a good idea for Canada to establish trade relations, trade agreements like these European countries are, with other countries outside, excluding the U.S.? Because that seems to be a valid approach. It may not be as advantageous, but it is at least something to soften the edges, don't you think? Would you support that?
It in my mind is an urgent requirement, and it's something that's going on very strongly right as we speak.
Good. I'm happy to hear that because I don't like bullies either, and I think that's how you handle a bully. You ignore the bully and go elsewhere and find right-thinking people and countries elsewhere. So, the other thing is, how the Canadians feel about American. I read that they've changed the Americana coffee to the Canadian coffee. That there's a bakery in Montreal that is making bagels that have the Canadian colors on the bagels. That a lot of people are shouting, as you said, shouting down Americans, and that'll last for as long as this is hot. And I don't see a time when people are going to, love America again. But the question is, what do you do with individual Americans who would like to come over? Now, we've talked about this before. We talked about it in the context of Vietnam War and deserters from the American Army in the 60s. But that issue is rising. That issue is emerging as a very important issue for a lot of people who are afraid. They think the American government is on a major decline, that the executive is not operating properly, that Congress is not operating at all. It's all GOP MAGA people, that the Supreme Court is not reliable, and that to the extent that the federal courts, and for that matter, the state courts, are taking positions against Trump and issuing injunctions against his various machinations, and cutting the government, he is ignoring them. He and Elon Musk have made it clear they intend to ignore a court process, which is really very troublesome, because at the end of the day, the courts, people generally see the courts as the last bulwark, the last defense, the last guardrail. And now the courts seem to be, although they make the right decisions, Trump is ignoring them. So, people are very afraid. They're afraid that their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor are going to be undermined by what he's doing. And with a pathological personality, the more he gets away with, the more he's likely to do. So if he's a bully at 2x today, he'll be a bully at 4x tomorrow. And people are afraid. They want to get out. But they all ask themselves, where can I go? And Canada looks better and better and better. But is Canada willing to take them? Or is Canada going to throw up its own wall?
Canada could not take, 10 or 11 million people if the U.S. wants to round them up and stick them in detention camps and send them back to somewhere. And if Canada's a first choice for those people, you certainly would have trouble taking very many. You got to remember, Canada has, 41 or 2 million people spread out over a very large geographical area, and we currently have a somewhat of a crisis in our housing because Canada allowed too many immigrants in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly coming in as students or temporary workers, sneaking in under programs that were meant, to help the country, and ended up not the programs being not so well designed that people were taking advantage of them. For example, international students coming enrolling at a university, paying for the fees, but really not intending to go to the university, maybe going and showing up for one course, but or registering for it, not necessarily even showing up in attendance for lectures, and not caring whether they pass or fail, just out into the labor force. Canada can't absorb too many people. If you're to say Canada's immigration system has always been designed until recently on a points system, as the more a person can contribute to the Canadian economy, the more points they would get. And most Americans would be first pick for, if they wanted to come, they would pick an American over most Europeans, because Americans are more similar to Canadians than anybody else. Or let's say they used to be anyhow. When I went to university in the US, I thought they were pretty similar. I found people from the southeast US to be quite different than me, but people from, the southwestern US or northwestern US or north central US, northeast US to be very similar to, essentially the same kind of person as a Canadian. Well, economically, though, I just think that the whole choice by Trump of imposing tariffs the way he is not going to work. It is going to diminish the United States in terms of its um, economy relative to the rest of the world. It's going to diminish the U.S. in terms of its influence in the rest of the world. Russia and China will be cheering like crazy for Trump right now, saying, go baby, go, just keep doing your stupid things because you're doing nothing that they could possibly do that would enhance their position as much as what he is doing for them.
I talk about Americans crossing the border north and trying to find a home in Canada, and it's just syllogistic, but I believe that there must be a lot of Americans who are thinking about that right now today because it's getting worse. But what about Canadians coming south? I know there's always a lot of Canadians that you meet who come south, who want to get jobs and have lives in the U.S. Is this affecting the flow of Canadians into the United States?
It certainly is. There's lots of anti-American propaganda going on right now in Canada. One of the items is people. A lot of Canadians are what they call snowbirds. Now, people in the northern U.S., especially, central states where the temperature is colder than along the coasts, like Minnesota type of thing, they would have a summer cabin in Padres Isle in Texas or somewhere in Florida, or, and somebody in Idaho would have a place in, Palm Springs, California. Now, lots of Canadians actually have second homes there, and they will definitely travel to those places, for the winter. Well, an awful lot of them have, the publicity in Canada is a lot, have been selling their second homes. They, in these places, where there's lots of extra real estate for sale in some of these places, Phoenix, Arizona, and, Palm Springs, California type of places, that Canadians would go for, you know, you know, January, February, and March kind of thing, be in Canada for Christmas and leave right after, kind of thing. Um, but the, um, for a reasonably wealthy American, Canada would be an ideal place to go rather than anywhere else. For, middle class Americans still working, Canada would be the most similar place for them to gain employment again. For Americans that are of a retirement age, Canada would be, terrific in terms of economy and acceptance of the people. There's a difference of where they come from. You're from Hawaii, and you say, gee, I'm going to move from one of the world's most wonderful places climate-wise, I'm going to move to Canada. And there's a fair difference. Canada's climate right now in February, you have parts of Canada that are at, 20 degrees below zero. You don't have too many places like Vancouver and Halifax. Let's just pick the opposite ends of the country that have, pretty nice weather in the winter. Much better than Chicago or Detroit. Those, Vancouver in particular, has much better weather. It's much like, Seattle is a much nicer place, you know, from September to May than almost all of the rest of the northern half of the United States.
That takes me to one penultimate question I want to ask you about sacrifice. For an American, forgetting Canada for a minute, for an American to hang around in the U.S. And suffer the slings and arrows of a declining economy, a declining country, it means sacrifice. And for that person to be involved in the opposition and take steps to oppose and to write and speak against the administration, against Trump, against Elon Musk, that could take sacrifice because you run the risk of getting on their lists, which they denied they had, but clearly they do have, against the press, against information, against healthcare and public health. So it means sacrifice. And now if I cross the border and go to Canada and I say, well, there's a lot of emerging patriotic Canadians that come out of this, finding a persona for the country, a patriotism for the country that might be greater than it was, 6 months ago. And the question I put to you is, how patriotic are they? How much sacrifice are they willing to make, even though their earnings will be less? The quality of life in Canada in a number of Canadian cities will be less as this goes forward. Will they stick to it? Will they continue in their enmity toward the United States, or will they cave in over time?
The trend is that they will do the opposite of caving in. Okay, the trend currently is much more pro Canada, pro together, and one of the things taking the same approach to the U.S. and if I think of Nazi Germany and how did Hitler come to power, and it was that the majority of the German population simply said, well, I'll just go on to my day-to-day thing, and I won't worry about the fact that my Jewish neighbor just got picked up by the Gestapo. I'll just go keep my head down and so on. And because the German population did that, it wasn't long before, Hitler had absolute control. And that seems to be happening in the United States right now to an alarming degree. On the other hand, there also seems to be a lot of people objecting and, phoning their congressman and, even if they are a Republican and saying you got to do something, but you simply look at the stupidity of the Republican representatives, whether they're for the House of Representatives or for the Senate, just acquiescing to every move Trump makes, no matter how stupid it is, no matter how bad it is for their state. They just are, doing what Hitler was able to accomplish in terms of silencing opposition. That's scary for Canadians to look at.
It's scary for Americans to look at, I'll tell you that. So, my last question to you is, and this is the very challenging question, is from all that you know, where is this going? And maybe there's no answer to this because Trump doesn't want to give you any stability, any predictability. But your thoughts, Ken, about where this is going and where the relationship, if you will, is going, and give us your thoughts about whether it's reparable, it's repairable, whether we can come back together again and love each other.
Where it's going, I think you have to sort of stand back and have what may be some of the underlying motives in Trump's approach. Um, I think that he naively believes that he can bully Canada around and then end up getting all of the things that he wants anyhow. And part of it, saying that, is to stand back and saying, what does Canada have that's important to the United States? And there's a lot of things. The all of the technology in the United States requires an awful lot of materials, particularly, what a lot of people call, precious metals or substances that the United States doesn't have much of. Now, the United States has a shortage of oil. Well, where do you get virtually all the oil that you're short? You're getting it from Canada. You can't heat all your own homes. You don't produce enough natural gas. Where do you get the gas from? You don't have enough electricity. Where do you get the electricity from? The items that the United States is short of or needs that they can't get along without. For example, what powers all of your nuclear reactors? Oh, uranium from Canada. So you really sit and say, why would Trump like to have a 51st state? It would guarantee American security. Why would he even say, gee, we'll even use the troops if we need to? It's because Canada has things the United States cannot get along without. And it's the handiest source. Why is Greenland of any value? Well, it has an awful lot of the same precious metals, precious things that the United States is short of, aside from geographically being, on air routes between Moscow and New York. The shortest distance, it's the best place to put up a early warning system or a way to stop any rockets. But I think in the medium term, I don't know about long term, but Trump has done irreparable damage to Canada and the US being closer. That Canada and the US will be further apart for quite some time. That is, if you can have a US president and therefore the US government that says it doesn't matter what contract we've signed, what deal we've made, whatever we've done in the past, we wish to use big bully extortion tactics to change the rules. Well, who's going to trust the United States? Like, certainly Canadians will not. And there are many things about Canada which Canadians value that the US does not have. The US, has a terrible, undemocratic election system. The Electoral College stinks. Particularly the funding of US elections. US elections are bought by the billionaires. Your current mess is an example of that, and their influence is right there at the front line, dismantling all the rules that keep them in check, reduce the size of government because they don't want to pay taxes. Canada's health system is far, far superior to the American one in terms of the average person. Nobody in Canada goes bankrupt because of the illness of a relative or their own illness. And so that even though you have in the United States states like California, which have far more, or Massachusetts, which have very high standards of living. They have many, many more social programs than other states. And they're much more similar to Canada. There's enough stuff that is different that Canada, as one or more states, if you said instead of 51st state, you might have 3 or 4 states, that really you couldn't accomplish the distinctions that make Canada so much better than the United States right now.
That leads me to a rhetorical question I want to ask you, my final question. And that is...
You never have a final question.
But thank you, Ken.
Try me.
Trump talks about making Canada the 51st state. What about making the U.S. the 11th province?
I don't think Canadians would want it. If you said would Canadians like Washington State, the answer would probably be a wholehearted yes. Would Canadians like, name another state? And the answer is maybe. Like you might have yes for Maine and yes for Vermont and yes for New Hampshire. Well, suddenly when you get, to Ohio, you might say, well, maybe. You say, well, would you leave your guns behind? Would you leave a bunch of the other attitudes behind?
Yeah, okay. All right, well, thank you. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our guest, Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you next time soon. Aloha.
Bye from Canada.